hours after a lawyer threatened the income keeping her inherited mine alive. 19-year-old Lenore Witt returned to the one wallboard that did not match the others. She slipped a pry bar behind it and pulled. The board came loose. Inside the wall sat a rusted Hills Brothers coffee can, hidden there for decades. Lenore carried it to the table and forced the lid open beneath the Coleman lantern. The first folded sheet was a hand-drawn plat. Beneath it lay a deed. Then she found an original mining filing stamped in 1949. Lenore stopped. Weeks earlier, another claimant had brought her a carbon copy, suggesting part of the mineral interest was still unresolved. She placed that copy beside Everitt Witt's hidden original. They told two different stories. Everitt's filing showed the surface and mineral rights recorded together. For the first time since the legal threat began, Lenore was no longer defending the mountain with hope. She was holding evidence. Her fingers tightened on the old paper. The garnets she had found were the only reason she could pay what the property already owed. Now someone was challenging the very ground producing them. Then Lenore opened Everitt's ledger. Near the end, she found an entry about herself. The great-uncle she had barely known had quietly followed her life from a distance. The inheritance had not been accidental. Everitt had chosen her. Lenore looked again at the papers covering the table. One explained why the mountain had come to her. Another could protect her right to keep it. But the carbon copy brought by the opposing claim said something neither of them did. By gray dawn, Lenore slid that copy directly over Everitt's stamped filing. The dates matched. The property matched. But the claim threatening Lenore did not. She pressed one finger against the contradiction. The paper being used to take control of her mind was now lying on top of the document that might prove the claim was wrong. The padlock came off easier than she expected. The hasp so rusted it crumbled like dried mud when she worked the bolt cutters into the gap. Monday, the 5th of October, 1987, and the sky above the Flint Creek Range had that hard blue color it gets right before the weather turns. No clouds. Just cold, sitting in the air like it was waiting for permission to fall. She had driven the truck as far as the old mining road would let her, then walked the last mile and a half up switchbacks, cut for men on foot and mules, not for anything with tires. Her breath fogging out in front of her the whole way up. The letter from the lawyer in Deer Lodge said she was inheriting a patented mining claim. 40 acres, one structure, mineral rights included. And she remembered thinking that sounded like something until she got the county assessment attached to it and saw the back taxes owed going 5 years deep. $211, sitting on top of a piece of ground nobody had wanted badly enough to pay for. Her great-uncle Everitt Witt had died in April without ever once mentioning her in a letter, without ever once that she knew of, saying her name out loud to her mother. She had met him twice as a girl. The second time he gave her a silver dollar and told her not to spend it on candy. She still had it in a drawer back in Butte, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper that had gone soft and yellow at the folds, sitting next to a photograph of her mother that she could not look at most days and could not throw away on any of them. Lenore Witt was 19 years old, and she owned nothing else on this earth. Her mother, Jeanette, had died when Lenore was 14. Cancer that started somewhere nobody could see and finished everywhere the doctors could. No insurance. The hospital in Butte sent bills for 11 months after the funeral, and Lenore watched her grandmother open each one at the kitchen table with the same expression a woman wears when she is counting the last of something. Her father had left before the diagnosis, and the word left was generous because it implied a destination. He simply stopped being in the house one Tuesday and never offered a reason. Her grandmother raised her after that, a woman named Bet, who smelled like lavender soap and black coffee, and who died in her sleep the previous winter without any warning at all, the way a candle goes out in a room with no draft. One morning she was at the stove making oatmeal, and the next morning the stove was cold, and Lenore was alone in a way that had no bottom to it. After that, she had lived in the house on Mercury Street for 3 months by herself, paying the electric out of what Bet had left in a checking account that shrank every time Lenore looked at it, eating rice and canned tomatoes 4 nights out of 7 because they were cheap and because she did not know how to cook much else and because sitting down to a meal she had not earned felt wrong in a way she could not explain to anyone who had not watched a woman die by degrees in a hospital bed. She applied for work at 3 stores and the packing plant and got hired nowhere because she was 19 and had not finished school, and the economy in Butte in 1987 was not hiring. It was folding, one storefront at a time, the way a deck of cards folds when you pull the bottom one out. The letter from the lawyer came on a Thursday in September. She almost did not open it because it looked like a bill, and bills had stopped meaning anything to her by then. They were just paper with numbers on them, and the numbers were always more than what she had. But the return address said an attorney's office in Deer Lodge, which was not a city she owed money to. So she tore it open, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water in her other hand. Patented mining claim. 40 acres, one structure, mineral rights included. The words sat on the page looking important and meaning nothing she could spend. Then she read the next paragraph about the back taxes and set the glass down carefully because her hands had started to shake, not from fear, exactly, but from the particular kind of anger that comes when the universe hands you something and charges you for the wrap. $211. She had $87 in the checking account. She had the house, which was rented. She had the truck, which was paid for but burned oil. She had a silver dollar in a drawer that a man she barely remembered had told her not to spend on candy, and she was not going to spend it on anything because spending it would mean he was really gone and the candy was really all there was. She drove to Deer Lodge the following Monday because she could not afford not to. Because 40 acres of ground, even ground with a debt sitting on top of it, was more than she had ever owned, and the alternative was Mercury Street, and the checking account going to zero, and whatever came after zero, which she did not want to find out. The shaft was exactly what she expected. Caved in maybe 30 feet from the entrance, timbers black and soft with rot, a rusted ore cart half swallowed by scree. Behind it, running down the slope toward Ruby Creek, sat a slag heap the size of a small barn, gray-brown waste rock nobody had touched since the pumps quit and the water came in. She did not look at it twice that first morning. Waste rock is waste rock. The cabin sat on a shelf of flat ground above the heap. Log built, chinked with something that had gone gray and hard as concrete. One window with the glass still whole, which surprised her more than anything else up there. The door was oak, swollen tight in its frame, and it took her shoulder, and the flat of a hatchet worked into the seam before it gave, with a crack that echoed down the hollow. Inside smelled like cold ash and mouse nest and something else underneath. Oilcloth maybe, or cedar. A wood stove sat cold in the corner with a coffee pot still on it. A calendar hung nailed to the wall, curled brown at the edges, showing March of 1961. A bed frame with a thin mattress gone lumpy with age. A shelf of tin cans with labels she did not recognize. Brands long gone, names that belonged to a country that had moved on without them. It was like he had walked out one afternoon 26 years ago, meaning to come back before supper and never had. She stood in the doorway a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, feeling like she had stepped somewhere she had not been invited, though by law at least she had. And there by the stove, along the wall where the shadows sat thickest, she noticed it without meaning to. A board maybe 14 inches wide, cut from a different mill than the boards around it. Nailed with square-cut nails where everything else in that wall used wire nails. Somebody had pulled a section out once and put it back, and the fit was close but not perfect. The way a lie is close to the truth but never quite sits flush. She figured it for old repair work. Water damage, maybe. And she moved on because there was a roof to think about, and the roof was not going to think about itself. She spent that first Monday cutting deadfall for the stove, a steel 026 that had come with the truck and the debt in equal measure. By noon, she had maybe a quarter cord bucked and split and stacked against the north wall of the cabin where the eave would keep the snow off it. October in that hollow meant the light came in low and orange by 3 in the afternoon, slanting up the slope instead of down, catching things at angles the summer sun never bothered with. She was hauling the last splits up from the chopping block when the slag heap caught that light and threw something back at her that was not gray. She stopped with an armload of wood and looked again, thinking maybe it was a piece of broken bottle glass or tin, or nothing at all, but it held steady, a dull wink of red-brown, like a coal that had not gone all the way out. She set the wood down on the porch step and walked over, her boots sliding a little in the loose tailings, and crouched at the spot. It was a chunk of the waste rock, same as all the rest, gray and pitted, but embedded in one face of it was a crystal the size of her thumb knuckle. Dark red, almost black in the shadow, glassy where the light hit it straight on. She worked it loose with her pocket knife, more out of habit than purpose. She had been raised to pick up anything that looked like it might be worth something. A nail, a bolt, a good piece of wire. And she dropped it in her coat pocket without much thought beyond that. She did not know what it was. She wanted to be honest about that because it would be easy now, 5 years on, to tell it like she had known right off, like some instinct had spoken up in her, standing on that heap. It had not. It was just a pretty rock, and she was 19 and cold and thinking about the roof, not about crystals. But standing there with her hands still in her pocket, she remembered something she had not thought of in years. Her great-uncle down in the valley at her grandmother's kitchen table. The one time she had met him when she was old enough to remember it clearly. She must have been 7 or 8. His hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the knuckles swollen and cracked from years of gripping tools harder than anything soft. Telling her father across the table, not looking at her, but meaning it for all the same. Don't ever sell the mountain, girl. Not for anything anybody offers you. The mountain is the only thing that does not lie to you, eventually. She had not understood it then, and did not much understand it now, standing over a heap of rock he himself had thrown away 35 years before. But it snagged on her the rest of that afternoon like a burr caught in a sock, small and persistent, while she finished stacking wood and let the light go from orange to gray to nothing at all. The next morning she found 2 more, one sitting loose on the surface where the frost had already cracked it free of the matrix, and one she had to work at with the chisel for 10 minutes before it came clean. Both had the same deep red color, the same glassy fracture where the light hit right. She wrapped all 3 in a shop rag and set them on the passenger seat of the truck, like they might roll off and break something. The truck was a 1971 Ford F-100, the heater fan rattling loose in its housing, and she kept one hand on the wheel and one hand checking the rag every few miles like a woman checking a sleeping child. She had found a listing in the phone book at the Deer Lodge Library, Continental Divide Rock and Mineral, on a side street off Montana Street, a storefront with a hand-painted sign and a window full of geodes and polished agate slices catching what light there was. The man behind the counter was maybe 60, heavy-set, wearing a canvas apron dusted white with rock powder. His name was Orin Gaskell, and he did not look up right away when the bell over the door rang. She set the rag down and unfolded it, and he came over slow, the way a man walks toward something he does not want to seem excited about. He picked up the largest piece, the one about the size of a walnut, still rough on 2 faces where it had broken off the matrix, and held it to the window light. Turning it, squinting. He asked where she had found it. She told him a played-out mine above Ruby Creek. Waste rock nobody had touched since the 50s. He nodded like that, confirmed something he already suspected, and set the stone on a loop stand, screwed a jeweler's loop into his eye, and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Almandine, he said finally. Gem grade mostly. Some of it has got too much iron staining to facet clean. But this piece here. He tapped the walnut-sized one. This will cut a stone worth having. She asked him what that meant in dollars, because she did not have the patience that day for anything but the number. He turned it over once more, set it down, and said $11. For that one, as is, uncut. He said if she had more like it, and if the color held dark and even the way this one did, he could take a few a week. Maybe more once the leaves came down and the light was better for grading them. $11. She stood there doing the arithmetic in her head against the tar paper she still needed. And the $211 the county said she owed by the 15th of December. And 11 felt like both nothing and everything at once. The kind of number that does not fix a problem, but proves the problem is not fixed to a wall. She took the cash, folded it into her shirt pocket. And then Orin Gaskell did something she did not expect. He leaned both hands on the counter and looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was not casual either. "How many people know you found these?" he said. It was not exactly a question. "Just you," she said. He nodded. Then he said it plain. "Do not tell anyone where you found them. Butte has ears, and the people with ears in Butte do not always have a conscience to go with them." She asked why he cared. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he picked up the two smaller stones and turned them over one more time, as if checking for something he had already found, and set them on the rag. Huh. Then he looked at her with an expression she would think about for weeks afterward. It was the face of a man who was calculating not the value of the stones, but the cost of saying what he wanted to say. "There was a man up Ruby Creek 30 years ago," Orin said finally, "before my father left me this shop, before I had anything except a pair of hands and his bench grinder. He brought in a stone like this one, and my father told him what it was and what it was worth, and the man went away and never came back. Not once, not in 30 years. He stopped there, set the loop down on the counter, and looked at the window where the afternoon light was going from yellow to gray, the way it does in October, when the days start pulling back like a hand from a hot surface. "I am not telling you that story for any reason except this one," he said. "Whatever is up there on that claim, it was there 30 years ago too, and the man who owned it chose not to take it. I do not know why. But I know that nobody in this town knows you are bringing stones to me, and that is worth more to you right now than the $11 in your pocket. Keep it that way." She stood there processing that. Not the warning, which was clear enough, but the 30-year gap. A man brings a stone in, learns what it is worth, and walks away forever. That sounded like a decision. The kind of decision a person makes when the cost of acting is higher than the cost of leaving a thing alone. She folded the rag around the two smaller stones he had not bought and put them in her coat pocket and walked out into the afternoon. The bell over the door rang behind her and then stopped, and the silence that followed it felt heavier than the stones. Driving back up the fire road, she passed the turnoff for Doss Cranfield's ranch without knowing who lived there yet, or that the man behind that fence line would become the only person in the valley she could sit with in silence and not feel watched. That would come later, in a week, when the wind brought the first real taste of winter, and she understood that a woman alone on a mountain needs at least one person who knows she is there and does not want anything from her for knowing it. For now, she drove with the two unsold stones in her pocket and the $11 in her shirt and the name Orin Gaskell turning over in her mind, the way the stones turned under his lamp. She did not trust him. She did not distrust him either. He was something she had not encountered before. A man who appeared to know more than he was telling, and who had chosen to tell just enough to keep her safe, without telling enough to explain why her safety mattered to him. He said she could bring him a few a week. He said it again, a few, like the number mattered for reasons he was not willing to explain. She did not yet know how many stones that heap actually held, or what her great-uncle had known and never once said out loud. The frost came the following Tuesday, the 13th, settling over the hollow sometime before dawn and turning the truck's windshield into a sheet of white feathers. She had to scrape it with the edge of an old license plate, because she could not find the ice scraper anywhere in the cab. The radio out of Butte said it was 26 degrees at the airport and colder in the low ground. And she stood on the porch that morning with her coffee, going cold in her hand, looking at the roof over the north room where the shakes had curled back like old bark, and knowing that whatever the sky did next would not wait on her arithmetic. She went at the slag heap that day with a swing rock hammer she had found in a coffee can of loose hardware in the tool shed, the handle worn smooth and dark from some hand that was not hers, and a cold chisel she kept sharp on the bench grinder her great-uncle had bolted to a stump 40 years before she was born. She learned the heap in pieces that morning. Some of the garnet sat shallow in a crust of quartz and mica schist that let go clean if she worked the chisel at an angle just off the crystal face, tapping hemp light, listening for the sound to change from a dull knock to something almost hollow before she pried. Others were seated deep, wedged in matrix that did not want to release them. And if she got greedy and swung too hard, the whole stone would crack through the middle, and she would be left holding two ruined halves instead of one whole dollar. By noon, she had 4 good stones and a coffee can half full of shards, and her hands were cut in 3 places from rock that had no business being that sharp. She sat on an overturned bucket and ate a sandwich she had made the night before, bread going stiff in the cold, and looked at the roof again, doing the same sums she had been doing since the 14-mile drive back from Butte. The shakes ran $9 a bundle at the lumberyard in Deer Lodge, and she needed at least 6 bundles, plus tar paper and nails, and none of it accounted for the 211 sitting over her head like its own kind of weather. She worked until the light went flat and gray around 4, and by then she understood something about the heap that no one had told her, and that her great-uncle, if he had ever known it, had never once written down where she could find it. The stones came easiest not where the rock looked richest, but where the frost had already worked at it for 35 winters before hers, opening the seams for her one slow crack at a time. The mountain doing patient work long before she ever thought to pick up a chisel and finish it. She never took more than 3 stones into that shop in a week, even when the heap was practically shedding them. Even when she could have filled a coffee can and walked out with $400 in an afternoon. Orin Gaskell never asked why she came in slow instead of heavy. She thought he understood without her saying it. A person who shows up with a shoebox full of stone all at once is a person somebody is going to ask questions about sooner or later, and questions were the one thing she could not afford yet. Not until she had paper to answer them with. One Tuesday, he held a stone up to his bench lamp for a long time after she set it on the counter, turning it slow. Then he set it down and said something she was not expecting. "This one is better than last week. You are learning." It was the only praise he ever gave her in those early weeks. She carried it down the mountain road in the truck cab, like it weighed more than the $11 folded into her shirt pocket beside it. That Saturday, she drove into Deer Lodge for a roll of 30-pound felt and 16 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, the kind that would not rust through by 1990. She kept a green-covered composition book she had bought at the Rexall for 60 cents, the kind with the marbled cover that every kid in Calplay County had carried to school at some point. She ruled it into columns with a pencil and a yardstick because she did not trust herself to keep the numbers straight in her head. Not with the roof and the taxes and the truck all needing money at the same time. All of them patient the way debts are patient, which is to say, not patient at all underneath the waiting. She wrote it all down, not because anyone was asking to see it, but because a person who does not write it down starts believing whatever story is easiest. And the easiest story that fall would have been that she should have more than she did. By the last week of October, she had patched enough of the roof that a hard rain did not sound like a threat anymore. Just weather. The old rancher showed up on a Thursday afternoon when the light was already going flat and the wind was carrying the smell of snow from somewhere north of the divide. She heard his truck before she saw it, a sound different from hers, a diesel knock she did not recognize. And she set down the chisel and walked to the edge of the porch with her hands still dusty from the heat. His name was Doss Cranfield, and he looked like the country he lived in. 77 years old or close to it, face cut deep with sun and wind, wearing a canvas coat that had been patched at both elbows and a hat that had seen more weather than most roofs. He climbed out of a battered Dodge with a quarter of smoked venison wrapped in butcher paper and a coil of good rope slung over one shoulder, and he set both on the porch rail without asking if she needed them. He knew she did. That was the kind of man he was. He had ranched the valley below Ruby Creek for 40 years. He was the last living person in Powell County who remembered Everitt Witt as anything other than a name on a tax roll. He told her Everitt had been a quiet man, not unfriendly, but the kind of quiet that comes from spending too many years talking to rock and getting nothing back. He would come down to Doss's place once or twice a year for salt and coffee and whatever news the radio had not already told him, and they would sit on the porch and not say much, which was fine with both of them. Then Doss set his coffee cup on the rail and looked at her straight and said what he had come to say. "Girl, I do not know what that lawyer told you, but this piece of ground does not feed anyone. Everitt lived up here like a ghost for the last 30 years of his life. If you have got any sense in you, you will sell it to the county for the back taxes and take whatever is left over and buy a bus ticket somewhere else." Lenore looked at the venison on the rail, at the rope, at the man who had driven up a bad road to bring them to her and was now telling her to leave. "I am not selling it," she said. Doss studied her a long while, his eyes moving from her face to the cabin to the slag heap and back. Then he nodded once, slow, recognizing something he had seen before and knew better than to argue with. "Hard-headed," he said. "Same as your uncle." He turned to go, and then stopped with one boot on the running board and set it over his shoulder like an afterthought, though she would learn later it was not an afterthought at all. It was the reason he had come. There is a man in Deer Lodge named Griff Pemberton, runs the bank. He has bought 3 plays-out mining claims in the last 2 years by letting the taxes stack up until the county puts the land on the block. Then he buys them for nothing. You should know that. He got in the truck and pulled the door shut, and the diesel knocked its way back down the fire road, and she stood on the porch watching the dust settle and thinking about the name, Griff Pemberton, and the 15th of December, and how close those two things sat to each other in a county where a banker had patience and a 19-year-old girl had $211 worth of reasons not to. She made the first of the tax payments on a Monday, drove into Deer Lodge with cash in an envelope, and walked into the courthouse and paid $60 toward the 211. The woman behind the counter stamped the receipt without comment. But the trip did not end at the courthouse. She needed stovepipe, a section of used pipe she had heard about from a widow outside Avon, $4, elbow joint and all, and it fit the old Riverside stove close enough that she only had to pack the gap with stove cement. But the pipe would have to wait because the hardware store in Deer Lodge was closed for the afternoon. And she found herself Main Street with an hour to fill, and a truck that burned gas whether it was moving or parked. The bank sat on the corner of Main, and second, a 2-story building with stone trim and brass door handles polished bright enough to catch a reflection. She did not intend to go in. She had no reason to. But the sign in the window said Powell County Savings and Trust, and underneath in small letters, G.R. Pemberton, President. And she thought of what Doss had said about a man who bought land by letting taxes stack up. And she walked in because sometimes you learn more about a thing by looking at it than by looking away. The lobby was warm and smelled like floor wax and the kind of cologne that men wear when they want you to know they can afford it. A teller directed her to a chair by the window and said Mr. Pemberton would be available shortly. She had not asked for Mr. Pemberton, but she sat down anyway. He came out of a glass-walled office in the back, maybe 50, gray at the temples, wearing a vest and a tie with a knot so precise it looked like it had been engineered rather than tied. He shook her hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive and offered her coffee she did not take. When she told him her name and the claim number, something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like a piece falling into a position it had been waiting for. He said he knew her uncle, said it with the careful distance of a man who means he knows what someone left behind, not who they were. A good man, he said, but he spent his life chasing a vein that was never there. And then he made his offer. He would pay the back taxes in full, $211, plus $500 cash for Lenore to start over somewhere else. He said it was fair. He said it was generous even, for 40 acres of caved-in mine and a cabin with a roof he could see daylight through. "You are 19 years old," he said. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his vest, already finished with the conversation in his own mind. $500 buys a lot of things at 19. She looked at his hands, at the brass pen holder on his desk, at the way the afternoon light caught the edge of his glasses and made them flash like something signaling from a distance. "No, thank you," she said. He did not seem upset. That was the thing she noticed. A man who gets upset when someone says no is a man who expected the answer. A man who does not get upset is a man who has another way to get what he wants. "The deadline is December 15th, he said. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." She drove back up the fire road, with the stovepipe rattling in the truck bed, and the $500 she did not take sitting in her mind like a door she had closed but could still hear someone standing behind. The letter came 6 days later. A white envelope in her mailbox at the post office in Deer Lodge, typed address. Return address printed in the same block letters as the sign on the bank window. She opened it standing at the counter with her back to the postmaster because she did not want anyone to see her face while she read it. It was polite. That was the first thing she noticed and the thing that bothered her most. Not a threat, not a demand. Just a paragraph reminding her that the tax deadline was December 15th and that her remaining balance was $140. Beneath that, a second paragraph offering to pay the full balance plus $800 cash for the surface rights and all improvements. More than the $500 he had offered in person. The number had gone up, which meant he wanted the land more than he had let on in that glass-walled office, with his hands folded over his vest. The letter ended with a sentence she read 3 times. "I would hate to see that property go to auction when there is a simpler path for everyone." She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and drove back to the cabin and sat on the porch with it in her lap for a long time. $800 was more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. $800 was a bus ticket and a rented room and a winter spent somewhere warm, and the beginning of something that was not this. But it was also the end of something, and the something it would end was the only thing she had ever been given by a person who shared her blood and her name. She put the letter in the stove and watched it curl and blacken and fall to ash among the coals. Then she went out to the heap and worked until the light went. The weeks ran together after that in a rhythm she did not choose but learned to keep. 3 stones a week to Orin, never more. The notebook filling up one careful line at a time. Tuesday, October 20th, 2 stones, $19 even. 4 bundles of cedar shakes. Saturday the 24th, 3 stones, $26, felt and nails. By the first week of November, the roof was sound. The stovepipe drew clean. The ledger showed $11 ahead, instead of behind for the first time since August. She owed $140 on the taxes, and it was already the 29th, with the ground starting to ring hard under her boots in the mornings, and the creek showing a skin of ice along its edges by 7. She sat by the stove that night, with the notebook open on her knee, running the column of figures twice to be sure, and she thought that if the frost held off the heap a little longer and Orin's prices held, she might just make it through without borrowing a dime from anybody in town, which was the only kind of pride she did have, and the only kind that had ever done her any good. She made the last of the tax payment on a Monday, the 9th of November, drove down to the courthouse with cash in an envelope for the final $151. Because she had paid 60 and then 20 over 2 previous trips, and the woman behind the counter stamped the receipt and slid it back to her across the counter without ceremony, just the clock on the wall ticking past 10. And by Thursday the 12th, she had let herself believe the worst of the fall was behind her. Roof sound, stove drawing clean, the notebook showing a number with no minus sign for the first time in her life. She was up at the heap that morning with a chisel and the mallet, working loose a piece of rock that had a good vein of red showing along one edge, when she heard a truck downshift on the fire road below the cabin. A sound she knew was not hers because hers had not run since Tuesday. It was a newer Ford, maybe an '84 dark blue under a week's worth of road dust, and the man who stepped out of it was about her age, maybe a year or 2 older, wearing a canvas coat too clean for mountain work and boots that had never seen a slag heap. He did not come up right away. He stood by the truck a minute, looking at the shaft entrance and the cabin and the heap like he was pricing all 3, and something in the way he did, it put her back up before he had said a word. He introduced himself as Colton Ferris, grandson of the man who had done the assay work on the claim back when it was filed. And he said his grandfather's name with the particular weight of someone who expects that name to still open doors in Powell County, even though the man himself had been dead a dozen years. Then he got to it plain enough. He said, "Fooling right under that heap had never actually passed with the surface claim. that his grandfather had filed the paperwork in 49 as a sayer of record and retained an interest in what came out of the ground, and that the family had never signed it away, and that as far as he understood it, everything sitting on that pile belonged legally to him. She stood there, with the chisel still in her hand, and did not say much of anything at first, because there was not much to say that would not have come out wrong. She told him she had a deed, and she had her great uncle Keem, and that was what she knew. He said deeds and claims were two different animals from mineral rights, and that he would be back with a lawyer out of Deer Lodge if it came to that, though he would rather it did not. On account of, and here he almost smiled, like he meant it to be friendly, he did not figure a 19-year-old girl wanted trouble any more than he did. Then he stopped at the edge of the heap on his way back to the truck and looked at the stones scattered across the surface and said it quiet, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. Granddad always said this mountain had more than silver in it. I guess now I know what he meant. That was when she felt it. Not the cold, though the cold was there. Something else. The understanding that Colton Ferris had not come up that road on a hunch. Somebody had told him about the stones. Somebody who knew what was coming out of this heap and going into Orin Gaskell's shop 3 pieces at a time. He left a folded paper with her before he drove off. A carbon copy gone soft and brown at the creases that he said his grandfather had kept in a filing box since before statehood records got reorganized in 61. It named the claim by number, same as the one stamped into the plat she had seen at the courthouse. But under the column for mineral disposition, somebody had written in pencil, gone nearly to nothing. Shared interest pending survey. No date on that line, no initials she could make out. Just 5 words that sat on the page like a splinter under a nail, small enough to ignore and impossible to. He got back in his truck without asking to see the heap up close, which struck her as strange even then. The way a man will show you his hand is stronger than it is by not asking to look at your cards. She watched the dust settle behind him on the fire road a long while before she went back to the chisel, and her hands, she noticed, had gone still on the handle without her telling them to. That evening she sat at the kitchen table, with the lantern turned up higher than she usually let herself burn kerosene, going back over what he had said, word for word. The way you turn a stone in your hand looking for the flat side. She read the pencil note 4 times. Each time she told herself a pencil note was not a signature, was not a filing, was not anything a court would weigh against a stamped claim. And each time some other part of her, the part that had grown up watching people in Butte lose ground to paperwork, nobody thought to keep, wondered if that was exactly the kind of confidence that got a person's ground taken out from under them. She set the paper down next to the deed and sat there a long while, not reading either one. Just looking at the 2 documents lying together, like they were arguing in a language she had not quite learned yet. Outside, the wind found the gap under the door and pushed at the flame in the lantern until it leaned sideways like a man falling asleep in a chair. And she sat in that unsteady light, thinking about Colton Ferris and Griff Pemberton and how both of them were waiting for her from different directions. One claiming what was under the ground and the other waiting for her to lose what was on top of it, and how between the 2 of them there was not a square foot of this mountain that somebody did not believe belonged to them more than it belonged to her. But she also thought about Orin Gaskell standing behind his counter saying, "Do not tell anyone where you found them." And the way he had walked toward those stones slow, like a man walking towards something he had seen before. And she thought about that for a long time in the kerosene light, turning it over the way she turned over stone. Because if Orin had seen Almandine Garnet from this mountain before, then the story she was living in was older than she had thought. And the question of who knew what and when they knew it had roots that went deeper than a pencil note on a carbon copy. She did not sleep well that night, but she did not stop cutting garnets either. That was the part she wanted to be honest about. Thursday night, she went back out to the heap with the lantern and pried 2 more stones loose before the cold ran hers inside. And she told herself it was because the roof still needed the money more than her conscience needed the certainty. And both of those things were true at once, sitting side by side. And two true things can share a bench without making a person comfortable. She did not know it then, standing in the gray light with the wood stacked and her hands raw from the chisel. But the heap had a whole history that had nothing to do with her, and it went back to a Tuesday in July of 1952. Hot enough that the men working the 80 dit had stripped to their union suits by 10 in the morning. Her great-uncle Everitt Witt stood at the mouth of the shaft that day with a hand-drawn assay chart gone soft at the folds. He was 34 years old, 3 years into the claim, and he told the two men he had hired that month to start hauling the deads out and dump them south of the tailings pond, away from the good ore. One was a Finn named Imo Tovanon, who did not talk much and did not need to. The other was a younger man everybody just called Sully Pardo, who talked enough for both of them and never seemed to mind that nobody was listening. The vein had been narrowing for 2 years by then. What silver came out of that ground in 1950 had run maybe 40 ounces to the ton if a man was lucky, and the assay office in Butte was not cheating him. By 1952, it had thinned to a seam you could lose with a bad swing of a pick. Tovanon knew it too. He had worked the Anaconda and the Badger State and half a dozen other holes in the ground between Butte and Phillipsburg, and he could read a vein the way most men read a newspaper, scanning for the part that mattered and skipping the rest. He told Everitt once, in the few words he used for anything, that the mountain was not lying. It was just finished talking. Everitt did not argue with him. A man who argues with a Finn about rock is a man who has already lost the argument. Sully was different. Sully believed in the next swing. Every morning, he came into the drift with the kind of energy that belongs to men who have not yet learned that effort and outcome are only loosely related. And he would hammer at the face for hours, filling the ore cart with material that was more host rock than silver. And when the cart came up into daylight and the assayer's report came back showing 12 ounces to the ton instead of, Sully would shake his head and say tomorrow would be better. He said it with such conviction that Everitt sometimes almost believed him. And Everitt understood in the part of a man that does not like to admit things that the mine was not going to make him rich. It was going to make him tired. He was already tired. 3 winters on that mountain had put 10 years on his hands and a stoop in his shoulders that did not straighten out anymore when the weather warmed. But the claim was his, and the bank loan was his, and the equipment was his, and the mountain was his. And a man does not walk away from what is his just because it has stopped paying. The waste rock came up mixed in with everything. Quartzite, schist, chunks of the dark reddish stone that studded through the country rock the way knots stud through a plank. Stones that sparked no interest from anybody because they were not silver, and they were not even proper garnet to men who did not know garnet from glass. Sully picked one up once, turned it over in the sun, and asked if it was worth anything. Everitt took it from his hand, held it up to the light with the quick disinterest of a man who has already decided, said it was pretty enough for a woman's dresser drawer and worthless everywhere else, and pitched it onto the growing pile himself. That was the whole of the appraisal. 30 seconds in July sunlight and 35 years of silence after. They dumped that heap through the fall of 52 and into 53. Cartload after cartload, the iron wheels of the ore cart grinding on the rail as it came up from the drift mouth and tipped its load over the south edge. By winter, the pile stood as tall as a man on horseback, a gray-brown monument to everything the mountain had given up that was not silver. Snow covered it by January, and when the snow melted in April, the garnet caught the spring light and threw it back in small red flashes that nobody was looking for and nobody saw. The following year, they dumped more on top, and the year after that, until the heap was a permanent feature of the claim, no different from the boulders or the creek or the ridge itself. A thing that had always been there as far as anyone who came after would know. Tovanon left first, not because the vein gave out, but because he had been offered work at the Kelly mine in Butte, where the copper was still paying, and a Messian could send money home to a wife he had not seen in 3 months. He came up to the cabin on his last morning and shook Everitt's hand and said one sentence in Finnish that Everitt did not understand and Tovanon did not translate. Then he picked up his kit bag and walked down the fire road and did not look back, which was the Finnish way of saying goodbye to a mountain. You do not turn around because the mountain will still be there whether you look at it or not. Sully lasted 2 more years. The army letter came in the fall of 1955, and he read it at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his face going through expressions that Everitt could not read and did not try to. Sully left the next morning before dawn. The coffee sat on the stove until it turned to paste, and neither Everitt nor the empty cabin poured it out. The vein gave out for good in the spring of 1957. Everitt stayed on another year, working smaller and smaller pockets of ore that barely paid for his own zoots, going deeper into the number 6 drift, where the water seeped through cracks in the hanging wall and pooled around his ankles, and turned his leather boots white with mineral salt. He was alone on the mountain for the first time in 6 years. The cabin that had held 3 men and their noise and their coffee and their arguments about where to drill next was now a one-man cabin, and the silence in it was different. From the silence Lenore would find 30 years later, his silence was the silence of subtraction. Hers would be the silence of arrival. They sounded the same, but they meant opposite things. And somewhere in that last stretch, though Lenore would not know this for weeks yet, would not know it until she was on her knees in that cabin with a crowbar and a coffee can in her lap. He sat down one evening with a ledger and wrote something about the red stones that he never told a living soul and never acted on. Not once, not for the rest of his life. She found the ledger on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November, in a box under the cabin's one good bunk. Water stained at the corners, the pages gone soft as cloth. She had been looking for rags to stuff into a gap in the chinking, where the wind came through at night like a blade. And the box was shoved back against the wall, behind a pair of boots that had gone stiff and white with mildew. She almost did not open it, almost set it aside with the boots and the mouse-eaten wool blanket folded on top. But the ledger had weight to it, the kind of weight that says someone once cared enough to write things down. And she had learned from her own green notebook that writing things down was a form of respect for the truth, even when the truth was not what you wanted it to be. The first pages were supply lists, blasting caps by the box, their prices climbing year over year the way prices do when a man is not looking at them closely enough to notice. Drill steel, candles, lard by the pound. The handwriting was square and careful. A schoolteacher's hand applied to numbers that no schoolteacher would have recognized as anything worth recording. 23 pages of it, a life measured in what it consumed rather than what it produced. Then the entries shifted. Fewer numbers, more words. The handwriting loosening as if the hand behind it had started to trust the page more or care about neatness less. He wrote about the cost of a new bit for the rock drill and how it took 2 days to get it up the mountain from Deer Lodge on a mule that wanted to go sideways on every switchback. He wrote about patching the cabin roof for the first time, using shakes he had split himself from a cedar that blew down in the October storm of 1953, and how the shakes were not as good as Millcut, but they kept the water out, and that was the only standard that mattered up there. He wrote about the number 4 drift flooding in the spring of 1955 and how it took him and Tovinen 6 days with hand pumps to get the water down enough to see the face again, and when they did, the face had nothing to show them that was worth the 6 days. He wrote about Sully Pardoe getting a letter from the army and leaving the next morning without finishing his coffee, and how the coffee sat on the stove until it went to paste, and nobody poured it out because pouring it out would mean admitting he was not coming back. There was an entry from the winter of 1956 that Lenore read twice because it did not sound like the rest. It said that the snow had come early and stayed late, and the road was impassable for 3 weeks, and he had not spoken to another person in 22 days. He wrote that the silence was not unpleasant, that it had a quality to it that was different from loneliness, though he could not explain the difference in a way that would make sense to someone who had not experienced both. He wrote that the stove was good company and the mountain was honest company, and that he had begun to suspect that honesty and silence were more closely related than most people were comfortable admitting. And then the entry dated March 11th, 1958, written in a hand that had started out square and careful, and by then had gone loose with cold or whiskey or both. He wrote that the number 6 drift had pinched out again, third time that winter, and that Ernie Sabo from the assay office in Deer Lodge had come up to look at a sample and laughed about the red stones in the waste. Called them Garnet. Said a jeweler in Missoula might give a man a nickel apiece for the good ones. Maybe less. Everitt wrote that down flat. No comment. The way he wrote the price of blasting caps or the weight of a mule's feed. But 3 lines later, in different ink, like he had come back to the page another night, he had added 7 words that Lenore read 4 times before she closed the book. Might be something in that, after all. Do not have the time to chase 2 rabbits. She sat on the edge of the bunk, with the ledger open on her knee, and the stove ticking behind her, and thought about that line longer than she had. Thought about almost anything else on that mountain. He had sunk 11 years and every dollar he could borrow from the bank in Butte into a vein that kept thinning and pinching and lying to him just enough to keep him coming back. And somewhere in there a man handed him the truth for free. And he set it down like a debt he did not have the credit to collect on. He was gone 9 years before she was born. But she knew men like that in town. Men who would rather lose slow at a thing they had chosen than win fast at a thing that felt like giving up. She did not have that problem, sitting on that bunk in the cold with the ledger in her lap. She did not have 11 years sunk into anything. She had a caved shaft and a roof with 3 weeks left of dry weather over it, if she was lucky, and a heap of rock. The frost had been quietly working loose since before her father was born. Whatever pride there was to spend, she had not earned it yet. The following Tuesday, she brought 3 stones to Orin's shop and set them on the counter the way she always did. Wrapped in the shop rag, spaced apart so he could see each one without picking them up first. He examined them under the bench lamp and named a price, and she nodded and took the cash. And then she did not leave. She stood at the counter with the money folded in her hand and asked him straight, "Did you know my great-uncle?" It was not a question that allowed for a comfortable answer, and Orin did not try to make one. He set the loop down on the counter and was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the clock on the wall behind the register and the sound of a truck passing on Montana Street outside, and the particular quality of silence that comes when a man is deciding how much of the truth he can afford to spend. Then he told her. Everitt had come into this shop in 1958. Not this counter, but the one that had been here before it. Orin's father's counter, in the years when the sign outside still said Gaskell and Sons, and Orin was 22 and learning the trade by watching his father's hands, more than listening to his father's words. Everitt had walked in with a single stone wrapped in newspaper, set it down without ceremony, and asked what it was. Orin's father picked it up, held it to the window, and said the same word Orin had said to Lenore 2 months ago. Almandine. Gem grade. But Everitt never came back. He paid a nickel for the appraisal that Ernie Sabo had laughed at, put the stone in his coat pocket, and walked out the door and up the mountain, and did not bring another stone down for the rest of his life. 30 years. Not one more. Orin paused. He picked up a polishing cloth from the counter and folded it and set it down again. And Lenore understood that the folding was not about the cloth. It was about giving his hands something to do while his mind decided how much further to go. My father asked him to bring more, Orin said. Told him what the stones were worth. Told him a man could make a living off that heap if he had the patience to work it right. Your uncle listened to all of it, and then he said something my father never forgot. He said he had come too far down one road to turn around for another, and that the silver would come back if he waited long enough. The silver never came back. Orin said it without emphasis, the way a man states a fact that stopped needing emphasis a long time ago. Lenore asked the question she had been holding since she walked in. If you knew what was up there, why did you never go looking for it yourself? Orin looked at her a long while. Then he said it the way a man says something he has thought about for decades and still believes. Because it was his ground, not mine. And because my father taught me that a man has the right to miss what belongs to him if that is what he chooses. He paused. Then he reached under the counter and opened a drawer she had never seen him open before and brought out something small wrapped in a square of blue felt. He unfolded it on the glass countertop, and inside was a garnet, cut and polished, deep wine red, catching the light from the bench lamp in a way that made it look like it was holding its breath. Smaller than the ones she'd brought in, maybe the size of a pea, but perfect. Every facet clean and symmetrical and alive, with the color that she had been pulling out of the heap in its rough, ugly form for weeks. "This is the stone your uncle brought in," Orin said. "I cut it the year I turned 30, when my hands were still steady enough for the wheel. I have had it in that drawer for 28 years. She looked at it a long time, a stone her great-uncle had held in 1958 and handed to a stranger and never asked about again. A stone that had been sitting in this drawer through Kennedy and Vietnam and the moon landing and Watergate and every other thing the world had done, while Everitt sat on his mountain chasing silver that was not there and ignoring Garnet that was. And then the second thought came, the one she did not want, but could not stop. Orin had known the value of Almandine garnet for 28 years. He had cut this stone himself. He knew what a finished gem was worth, and he was paying her $11 a stone. She did not say it out loud, not then. She picked up her money and her empty shop rag and walked out to the truck and drove north on Montana Street toward the highway. And the thought rode beside her the whole way home, sitting in the passenger seat where the stones usually sat, heavy and quiet, and asking a question she was not ready to answer yet. She went to the library the next afternoon. Not Orin's shop, not Dus's porch, the library. Because the library did not have an opinion about her or her mountain or her stones, and she needed a place that would give her facts without wrapping them in 30 years of somebody else's history. The Deer Lodge Public Library was a brick building on Missouri Avenue, with a card catalog that smelled like cedar, and a reference section that nobody seemed to use except her and a retired geology teacher who came in on Wednesdays to read the Missoulian. The geology teacher looked up when she walked in and then looked back down at his newspaper, and she was grateful for the disinterest because she did not want to explain what she was looking for or why. She found it in a reference guide to North American gemstones, published in 1983 by a university press in Colorado. The book was thick, and the index was organized by mineral family, and she turned to Almandine, under the Garnet section, and ran her finger down the page until she found the paragraph that changed the shape of her arithmetic. Almandine garnet, gem grade, rough and uncut, wholesale value dependent on clarity, color saturation, and size. The range printed in the book was $30 to $80 per stone for specimens of the quality she had been pulling from the heap. The book included a photograph of a rough Almandine crystal next to a ruler, and it looked exactly like the stones she had been wrapping in a shop rag and setting on Orin's counter 3 at a time for weeks. Orin was paying her $11. She sat at the library table with the book open in front of her and the green notebook beside it and did arithmetic that made her stomach turn. 3 stones a week at $11 was $33. 3 stones a week at $30, the low end of the book's range, was $90. The difference was $57 a week. $57 was the distance between taxes and paying the taxes and buying a winter coat and having money left for gasoline. And maybe, if the numbers held, putting something aside for the first time in her life that was not earmarked for a debt or a repair or a bill she was already behind on. She was not angry. Not yet. Anger required certainty, and she did not have certainty. She had a number in a book and a number on Orin's counter, and the distance between them, and the distance could mean he was cheating her, or it could mean something else she had not thought of yet. She needed more information before she could afford to be angry, and information was the one thing she had learned to collect slowly. She drove back to the cabin and sat on the porch in the last of the daylight and turned it over, slow, looking for the crack that would let her see inside without breaking the whole thing apart. She could find another buyer. There were jewelers in Missoula and Helena listed in the phone book at the library, and she had written their numbers in the back of the green notebook in pencil, small enough that nobody could read it from across a counter. She could drive the stones herself and cut out the middleman and triple her money in a week. But another buyer would ask where the stones came from. Another buyer would tell someone. And in a town where Griff Pemberton already knew her name, and Colton Ferris already knew about the Garnet, another set of questions was a luxury she could not afford. $11 a week and silence, or $50 a week and exposure. She sat with those two numbers on the porch while the light went from gold to gray and the first stars came out over the ridge, and she chose the 11. Not because it was fair, but because it was safe. And safe was the only currency she had left that nobody else was trying to take from her. The following Saturday, she drove into Deer Lodge for stove cement and a bag of rice and saw something that stopped her cold on Main Street. Colton Ferris's blue Ford, the 84 with the road dust, parked outside the Powell County Savings and Trust, right in front of Griff Pemberton's polished brass door handles. She saw it from half a block away, and her foot came off the gas before her mind caught up with her body. The truck was empty, which meant Colton was inside. Inside Pemberton's bank. On a Saturday morning when the bank was only open until noon and the only people who came in on Saturday mornings were people who had business that could not wait until Monday. She did not stop. She drove past at the same speed and watched in the side mirror until the truck was out of sight. Then she pulled into the parking lot of the hardware store 2 blocks down and sat behind the wheel with the engine running and her hands still on it and tried to think clearly about what she had just seen. Colton Ferris had come to her mountain 2 weeks ago and told her the mineral rights were his. Griff Pemberton had come to her 3 weeks before that and offered to buy the surface for back taxes and $500 cash. She had thought of them as 2 separate problems, the mineral rights and the taxes, the man who wanted what was under the ground and the man who wanted what was on top of it. 2 threats, 2 directions, 2 different kinds of trouble. But they were parked in the same building on the same Saturday morning, and the only thing they had in common was her mountain. Whatever they were discussing behind those brass handles and that glass wall and that engineered tie knot, it was not the weather. She bought the stove cement and the rice and drove back without stopping anywhere else. Her hands stayed tight on the wheel for the next 6 miles, and by the time she turned onto the fire road, the 2 problems had collapsed into 1 problem. And the 1 problem was worse than either of them had been alone. She told Doss about it. Drove down the fire road to his ranch on a Sunday afternoon when the light was the color of old brass and the valley below the ridge was filling up with shadow. She told him because she needed to say it out loud to someone who would not try to buy anything from her or file anything against her or tell her she was too young to understand what was happening. Doss was the only person in the valley who met all 3 conditions. He was on the porch when she pulled in, sitting in the same chair he always sat in with a cup of coffee, balanced on the arm and a dog lying at his feet that raised it when the truck door opened and then put it back down again, deciding she was not worth the effort of standing up for. She sat in the other chair and told him about Colton's truck at the bank and the 5 words on the carbon copy and the $800 letter she had burned in the stove. Doss listened without interrupting. His coffee went cold. The dog shifted once and settled. The shadow crept up the valley wall behind him, and the light on the porch went from brass to silver, and still he did not speak. When she finished, he sat there a long time looking at the ridge where the claim sat, though from this distance and this angle you could not see the cabin or the heap or anything, except the tree line and the sky above it. Then he set the cup down on the porch rail and told her something she had not asked for and did not expect. The reason Everitt never came down off that mountain, Doss said. The reason he stopped coming to town, stopped coming to this porch, stopped going anywhere at all. It was not the silver running out. A man can outlast a played-out vein. Everitt outlasted a dozen of them. It was your mother. He told it plain because plain was the only way Doss knew how to tell anything. Everitt had an older brother named Thomas, Lenore's grandfather. Thomas had worked the Anaconda in Butte for 12 years, underground copper. And he was good at it in the way that some men are good at dangerous things, which is to say he had survived long enough to believe surviving was something he had earned, rather than something he had been lucky about. Everitt loved his brother and his brother loved him back, and the two of them talked about mining the way other brothers talked about fishing or baseball. It was the language they shared, the grammar of rock and drift and ore body and hanging wall. Thomas died in a shaft collapse at the Anaconda in 1961, a Wednesday in March. Timbers gave way in a section that had been flagged for reinforcement and never reinforced because the company was cutting costs that quarter, and Thomas and two other men were buried under 40 feet of rubble that took the rescue crew 3 days to move. They found him on Saturday. He had survived the initial collapse. The coroner said he had lived maybe 10 hours in the dark, and the marks on the timbers above him showed where he had tried to dig himself out with his hands. Jeanette was 30 when her father died. Lenore would have been a few months old, and something in Jeanette broke that March that never got put back together. She blamed the company. She blamed the mountain, and she blamed Everitt because Everitt was the one who had taught Thomas to love mines in the first place, who had taken him up to the claim on Ruby Creek when they were both young and shown him how to read a vein and work a drill and listen to the mountain. And Thomas had carried that love down to the Anaconda, and it had killed him. In 1965, Everitt came down to the valley for the last time. Drove all the way to Butte to see Jeanette. He wanted to meet the girl, Lenore. She would have been about 4 years old then. Jeanette would not let him through the door. She told him he had killed her father. She said the words standing in the doorway of the house on Mercury Street, with her hand on the screen door, and Lenore, somewhere behind her in the kitchen, too young to understand what was happening, or who the man on the porch was. She told Everitt that she would rather die herself than let her daughter set foot on anything he owned or touched or cared about. Doss paused. He picked up his cold coffee and looked into it and set it back down. He told me that night, Doss said, came down the mountain after dark and sat right where you were sitting and said he had lost the only family he had left. Not to death, to the memory of death. He said that was worse because at least with death you know where the person went. Everitt drove back up the mountain that afternoon and did not come down again. Not to Doss's ranch, not to town, not to anywhere. 22 years of silence after that, broken only by the paperwork that a man has to file to keep a claim active and taxes current, until even that stopped in the early 80s, and the taxes stacked up and the county sent letters he never opened. But he left the land to Lenore in his will. The only way he could speak to her without her mother's words standing in the doorway between them. Lenore sat on Doss's porch for a long time after he finished. The coffee was cold, and the light was going, and somewhere down in the valley a dog was barking at something. Only it could see. The dog at Doss's feet lifted its head at the sound and then settled back with a sigh that seemed to carry an opinion about the other dog's judgment. She did not cry. She had done her crying for her mother and her grandmother and for being alone in a cabin on a mountain at 19. And she did not have any left for a man she had met twice and never known. But something shifted in her chest. Not grief exactly. More like a piece of a map she had been reading, wrong turning right side up for the first time. The story she had been telling herself about Everitt Witt, the story of a man who had forgotten her or never cared, was not the right story. The right story was about a man who had been told he could not care and had obeyed the telling and had spent 22 years on some mountain with the obedience eating at him. She thought about her mother's face in the photograph on the dashboard of the truck. 26 years old and already furious at mines and mountains and the men who went into them. Jeanette had carried her father's death like a stone in her pocket for the rest of her life, and the weight of it had shaped everything around it. It had shaped Lenore's childhood and Everitt's exile, and the will that left 40 acres and a cabin and a slag heap to a girl he could not name out loud. He had watched her, from a distance. Through whatever channels a man on a mountain uses to keep track of a girl growing up in a city 60 miles away. He had known she existed and known he could not reach her and left her, the only thing he had that Jeanette could no longer refuse. A piece of ground with his name on it, and a heap of stones he had thrown away, and a cabin with a board in the wall that was not the same as the other boards. She drove back up the fire road in the dark, the headlights picking up frost on the road, and she did not turn on the radio, because the silence felt like it belonged to someone. On the seat beside her, the green notebook sat open to the page where she had written the day's stone count. And next to it, face down, the photograph of her mother that she had brought from the drawer in the house on Mercury Street. She had not looked at it in weeks. She picked it up at the first switchback and set it face up on the dash where the headlights of passing trucks would catch it if any trucks ever passed on this road at this hour, which they did not. Her mother had been 26 in that photograph. Younger than Everitt was when he filed the claim. Younger than Orin was when he cut the first stone. Younger than Doss was when he bought the ranch. 6, and already carrying the weight of a father dead in a mine shaft, and a brother-in-law she blamed for putting the love of mines into his blood. Lenore had never understood her mother's fury about mines and mountains, and the men who went into them. She understood it now, not agreed with it, understood it. And understanding it changed nothing about the mountain or the claim or the stones, but it changed the shape of the grief she carried for all three of them, the living and the dead and the one who had stood between. She kept cutting stones, kept bringing 3 a week to Orin, kept the green notebook filled in tight columns. November went by in a rhythm of frost and labor, and $11 increments that added up slow but added up. The routine settled into her bones like the cold did, gradually and then all at once. She woke before dawn because the stove needed feeding, and a stove that goes out in November takes an hour to get back to temperature, and an hour was time she did not have. She split wood while the coffee percolated, ate standing at the counter, bread and peanut butter, and whatever canned goods she had brought up from the store in Deer Lodge the previous weekend. Then the heap. She worked the heap in the mornings because the light was best then, low and sharp enough to catch thread in the stone, and because the cold had usually cracked new seams overnight that she could exploit before the afternoon sun warmed the rock and tightened them shut again. 3 hours with the chisel and the mallet and the coffee can filling one careful stone at a time. She had learned not to rush. The heap punished rushing. A swing too hard sent cracks through the crystal that ruined the stone and wasted the morning. And a morning wasted was $11 gone, and the notebook's upward line flattening out toward horizontal. Afternoons she spent on the cabin. There was always something. The chinking in the north wall needed patching every time the temperature dropped below 20, because the mud contract expanded and left gaps that the wind found before she did. The door frame had swollen, and then shrunk, and then swollen again, until the latch no longer caught, unless she lifted the door by the handle while she turned it. The truck needed oil every 2 weeks, and the heater fan had developed a new rattle that sounded like a bearing going, and probably was. She ate supper by lamplight and wrote in the notebook and went to bed early because kerosene cost money. And the dark came at 4:30, and there was nothing to do in the dark except think. And thinking after a certain hour always went to the same places. To her mother, to her grandmother, to the checking account on Mercury Street that would be empty by now if she had stayed, to the question of whether she had made the right choice coming up this mountain, or whether the mountain was just another version of the checking account, a thing that looked like it had something in it, but was really just a container for whatever fear she poured into it next. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky at 6 in the morning and the weight of the wind against the cabin wall at night. She learned which part of the heap gave up its stones easiest after a hard freeze and which part needed a week of warming before the chisel could find the seams. She learned to eat standing up at the counter with one hand on a sandwich and the other on the notebook, because sitting down for meals felt like a concession to the cold that she was not willing to make. By the last day of November, she was $43 ahead. The cabin was tight against the coming winter. The truck had new plugs that she had bought at the auto parts store in Butte and installed herself on the tailgate with a socket wrench and a flashlight held between her teeth. The green notebook showed a line that went up, instead of down for the first time since she had started keeping it. And the line was not steep, but it was steady, and steady was enough. And then Thursday, the 3rd of December, Colton Ferris came back. This time, he was not alone. The man with him was maybe 45, wearing a dark coat over a white shirt that was too white for a dirt road, and a pair of shoes that had been polished that morning, and would not survive the walk from the truck to the porch. He carried a leather briefcase that had not come from any store in Powell County. His name was Nolan Birch, and he was a lawyer out of Deer Lodge, and he did not bother with the almost friendly tone that Colton had used the first time. He stood on the flat ground between the cabin and the heap, with his briefcase held against his chest, and looked at the slag heap, and then at the cabin, and then at Lenore. And she could see him pricing all of it the same way Colton had priced it the first time, except Birch was not pricing the property. He was pricing her, calculating what she could afford and what she could not, and how long the distance between the two would take to close. He told Lenore what was going to happen next. He spoke in complete sentences with periods at the end of them, the kind of sentences that have been practiced in front of a mirror or a legal pad. He said his client had documented evidence of a retained mineral interest predating the surface claim transfer. He said the interest had been established at the time of the original assay and had never been formally relinquished or transferred. He said continuing to extract minerals from the property without addressing that interest could result in an injunction filed with the district court. He said the word injunction without emphasis, pronouncing it like a tool he had used before and expected to use again. "Miss Witt," he said, "I am not here to threaten you. I am here to inform you that continuing to extract minerals from this property without addressing our client's claim could result in legal consequences you do not have the resources to fight." She stood on the porch with her hands on the rail. The chisel was on the step where she had left it that morning, the mallet beside it, the coffee can with 3 good stones inside sitting next to the door. She looked past Birch to Colton, who was standing a few steps behind with his hands in his jacket pockets, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen the first time. Discomfort. He had not wanted it to come to this, but it had come and he was here, and the distance between wanting and doing had already closed. "I have a deed," she said. "I have a recorded claim." Birch nodded. He said he was aware of the deed. He said deeds were one instrument, and mineral rights were another, and the two did not always travel together, and that his client's position was supported by documentary evidence that predated the current chain of title. She asked to see the documentary evidence. He opened the briefcase and took out a manila folder and handed her a single sheet. It was the same carbon copy Colton had shown her before, the same pencil note, shared interest pending survey. 5 words in handwriting she could barely read. "This is a pencil note on a carbon copy," she said. Birch took the paper back and returned it to the folder and closed the briefcase with a snap that echoed off the cabin wall. "That is for the court to determine," he said. "We will be filing a preliminary motion by the end of the week. I would advise you to retain counsel." He turned and walked back toward the truck. Colton followed but slower, and at the edge of the flat ground, he stopped and looked back at her. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, and then closed it again and turned and kept walking. But Lenore called after him. "Not Birch, Colton." She said his name once, not loud, and he stopped with one hand on the truck door. "Your grandfather and my great-uncle worked this claim together," she said. "Whatever was between them, it was between them. Not us." Colton stood there a long moment with the wind pulling at his jacket and the frost on the fire road catching what was left of the afternoon light. He did not answer, but something moved in his face that looked less like calculation and more like the expression of a man who has walked further down a road than he meant to and is not sure how to walk back. The truck doors closed. The engine started. The sound went down the switchbacks and faded, and she stood on the porch holding the rail with both hands and feeling the cold come in through the gaps in her gloves. She understood for the first time what it meant to be caught between 2 forces that did not need to defeat her. They only needed to outlast her. She sat on the step and did the arithmetic the way she always did, in her head first and then in the notebook to make sure the head had not lied. If Birch filed an injunction and the court granted it, she could not cut stones. If she could not cut stones, she could not earn. If she could not earn, the taxes would stack again by next December. And if the taxes stacked, Pemberton would be waiting at the bottom of the pile with his $800 and his polished brass door handles, and his patience that was not patience at all, but appetite dressed in a patient man's clothes. The injunction did not need to succeed. It only needed to exist long enough to stop her from earning, and stopping her from earning was all Pemberton needed. The legal costs would do the rest. A lawyer to fight the motion would cost more than everything she had earned since October, and she did not have a lawyer, and the only person legally in Powell County who had offered her anything resembling legal information was a woman behind a counter at the courthouse who stamped papers for $2 and could not give advice. She went inside and sat at the table and looked at the wall by the stove. The board with the square-cut nails, the one she had noticed the first day and never opened because there was always something more urgent. The roof, the taxes, the stovepipe, the heap. But there was nothing more urgent now. Now, there was only the question of what her great-uncle had hidden and whether it could save her from the men who were coming for his mount. She did not open it that night. She was not ready. She sat with the lantern burning low, and the stove popping and the ledger open to the page with the 2 rabbits, and read those 7 words one more time. Do not have the time to chase 2 rabbits, but Everitt had found the time to hide something behind that wall. Something he wanted kept. Something he did not trust to a lawyer or a bank or a filing cabinet in the courthouse, where anyone with a reason and a $2 fee could look at it. He had trusted it to the wall, to the cabin, to whoever stayed long enough to notice the nails. She looked at the board with the square-cut nails, and the Coleman lantern threw her shadow across it, tall and wavering, and she thought about a man who had buried the truth behind a wall because he did not trust the world to leave it alone, and she wondered if he had been right. She opened it on a Friday, the 5th of December, 1987, 2 days after Birch and Colton had stood on her flat ground and told her the court was coming whether she was ready or not. The stove had burned down to coals some time past midnight, and the cabin held that particular cold that finds the gaps in the chinking no matter how careful the mud job. She lay on the cot staring at the board ceiling, and her eyes kept going to the wall by the stove. The eyes go to a door you know is unlocked in a house you are not sure is empty. She got up, lit the Coleman lantern. The hiss of it filling the cabin like a held breath let go. She took the pry bar from the tool shelf and worked the flat end into the seam where the board met the studs and pushed until the square-cut nails gave with a sound that was almost human. A groan, an exhale. Something letting go of something it had held for a very long time. Behind the board in the stud bay sat a coffee can. Hills Brothers, the old paper label gone soft and brown, rusted through at the seam on one side. She lifted it out with both hands and carried it to the table and set it down next to the deed and the carbon copy that were still lying there from the night Colton first came because she had not moved them. She had not been able to decide where they belonged. She worked the lid loose with a screwdriver and it came off all at once, spilling a little rust dust across the papers. Inside was a folded square of paper, brittle at the creases. Beneath it a second sheet, larger, hand-drawn. A plat with lines and bearings and a compass rose in the corner. The slag heap marked with an X and the shaft mouth marked with another. And under both of them a third paper, smaller, in handwriting she recognized it from the ledger. Short, dated. Written in the same hand that had written about the 2 rabbits, but steadier, earlier. A man still sure of his own pen. It said the ground and everything on it and under it, surface and mineral both, belonged to Everitt James Witt, free and clear, filed proper in Deer Lodge, witnessed by 2 names she did not know. She unfolded the first paper with hands that were not as steady as she wanted them to be. A claim filing, 1949. Powell County. His name typed at the bottom. A stamp beside it gone purple with age but still legible enough to read the county seal. The stamp matched the one on her deed. Same office, same authority, same law. She sat there a long time with the lantern hissing and the coals ticking in the stove, looking at that seal. The carbon copy with its pencil note lay on the table beside the filing, and she set them next to each other the way she had set the deed and the note together weeks before. But this time there was nothing arguing. The 2 papers agreed with each other completely. The claim filing said surface and mineral. The deed said the same. And the pencil note that Colton's grandfather had kept in a filing box for 38 years said shared interest pending survey. But the survey had never been done and the interest had never been recorded, and the filing in her hand had been stamped and witnessed and put into the books before anyone had written anything in pencil on anything. She felt something in her chest let go that she had not known was holding tight since the afternoon Colton first stood by the heap and said her grandfather's name. Like it was a key that opened doors. It was not relief exactly. It was the feeling of setting down something heavy after carrying it so long that her arms had forgotten what they felt like without the weight. Outside, the wind picked up against the north wall, and somewhere down toward the creek, a branch let go under new ice, and she sat with a can open in front of her, thinking about how a man could bury proof of everything he owned behind a wall and never once mention it to the person he left it all to. As if the hiding was the point. As if the finding had to be earned the same way the ground had to be earned, not by asking, but by staying long enough to wonder what was behind the board with the wrong nails. She did not go back to sleep. She sat at the table until the Coleman ran low and the first gray light came through the window. And then she pulled the ledger from the box under the bunk and opened it to the last pages. The ones she had not read. She had stopped at the 2 rabbits entry weeks ago because it had been enough. Because reading further had felt like opening a door into a room she was not sure she had been invited into. But the filing changed that. The filing was an invitation, written in 1949 and buried in a wall and waiting for whoever cared enough to pull the nails. The last entry had no clear date. The ink had faded to a pale brown that barely held its shape against the softened paper, and the handwriting was different from the rest of the ledger. Looser. The letters leaning into each other, the way old men lean into a wind they no longer have the strength to walk against. It might have been written a year before he died, or 10 years before. There was no way to know. But the words were clear enough. If someone is reading this, it means they stayed long enough to understand the mountain. That is the person I wanted to have it. I could not say your name out loud because your mother forbade it. But I watched you from a distance when I could. I saw you once at the hardware store in Butte when you were 12. You were looking at a display of pocket knives, the way a person looks at something they know they cannot have but have already decided they deserve. I nearly walked up to you. I did not. That is the thing I regret most on this mountain. More than the silver, more than the years. She closed the ledger and held it against her chest with both arms and sat in the gray light of that December morning without moving. The stove was cold. The lantern was out. The wind had stopped. And the cabin was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, steady and stubborn. The sound of a thing that refuses to quit even when the rest of the body has gone still. He had seen her when she was 12 years old, standing in a hardware store in Butte, looking at pocket knives she could not afford. He had been there, close enough to walk up to her and say her name and tell her who he was and why he had a silver dollar waiting in a drawer for a girl he had met once and thought about for the rest of his life. And he had not, because her mother's words had stood between them. And Everitt Witt was the kind of man who would rather carry a regret up a mountain for the rest of his years than push past a door someone had closed in his face. She remembered the hardware store. She remembered the pocket knives. She remembered standing at the glass case with her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, looking at a red-handled knife with 3 blades and a corkscrew, and wanting it with the pure, uncomplicated wanting that only comes when you are 12 and have not yet learned that wanting a thing and deserving a thing are supposed to be different. She did not remember seeing an old man watching her from across the aisle. She had not known he was there. He had been close enough to walk over and say her name, and he had not, and she had walked out of that store without any idea that the man her mother had forbidden from their lives was standing 10 feet away, holding a box of wood screws he did not need, watching her leave. And that changed something in the shape of the story she had been telling herself about this mountain and the man who had left it to her. It was not an inheritance of convenience. It was not the last resort of a man who had nobody else to leave it to. It was a letter he could not send, written in property lines and mineral rights and 40 acres of ground, that said, "I know who you are and I chose you, and I am sorry I could not say it while I was alive." She drove the truck down to Deer Lodge on Monday morning, with the coffee can wedged between her boots on the floorboard. 41 miles, most of it washboard until Highway 12 smoothed out. And the whole way she kept one hand off the wheel to touch the can, just to be sure. The way you touch something you are afraid might turn out to be a dream if you stop paying attention to it. The Powell County Courthouse sat on Main Street, with its brick gone the color of dried blood in the morning light. Inside it smelled like Florfax and old paper, a smell she had come to know from the tax office, 3 visits running. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the recorder's office sat at the end of a hallway, with linoleum tile that squeaked under her boots. The recorder's office was a narrow room with ledgers stacked to the ceiling in wooden cases that had been bolted to the walls before the war. The woman behind the counter had silver hair and reading glasses on a chain and hands that moved over the ledgers, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been finding things in books for longer than Lenore had been alive. Her name was Maren Jessup, and she pulled the 1949 volume down without much searching. She set it on the counter and opened it and turned to the third page and ran her finger down the column of entries and stopped. Same filing date, same witnesses, same stamp. Though the county's copy had kept its color better than the one from the wall, sitting flat in a drawer instead of a stud bay for 38 years. The ink was still dark enough to read without a lamp, and the seal was crisp where the one from the coffee can had gone soft and blurred at the edges. "That is recorded proper," Maren said, and she stamped a certified copy and slid it across the counter. $2. Lenore put the money down and picked up the copy and was turning to leave when Maren said her name. Not loud, the way a person says a name when they want to make sure the next words land where they are supposed to. "You know Nolan Birch filed a preliminary motion on this claim number last Friday," Maren said. "Mineral rights dispute. It is on the docket." Lenore stopped with the certified copy in her hand. She had known it was coming. Birch had told her it was coming. But knowing a thing is coming and seeing it on a docket are two different kinds of knowing, and the second kind sits heavier. Maren looked at her over the reading glasses. She did not lean forward or lower her voice, or do any of the things people do in stories when they are about to share a secret. She spoke at the same volume and in the same tone she had used to say $2. "The filing he is citing," she said. "The retained interest. It was never recorded in this office. I have checked the index twice. A pencil notation on a carbon copy is not a recorded instrument under Montana law. What is in the book is what counts, and what is in the book is what you are holding in your hand." Then she paused and added, almost as an afterthought, though Lenore understood it was not an afterthought at all, "That is not legal advice. I am just telling you what is in the book and what is not." Lenore stood in the recorder's office with the certified copy in one hand and the coffee can under her other arm, and understood two things at the same time. The first was that she had the paper she needed. The claim was recorded, surface and mineral, stamped and witnessed and entered into the books in 1949, before Colton's grandfather had written anything in pencil on anything. The second was that Birch had filed anyway, which meant either he did not know what Maren had just told her, or he did know, and was betting that a 19-year-old girl with no lawyer and no money would fold before the court ever had to look at the evidence. Both possibilities led to the same place, a fight she could not afford even if she was right. She drove north out of Deer Lodge on Highway 12 and did not stop at Orin's shop. She drove past it, past Montana Street and past the storefront with the hand-painted sign and the window full of agates, and past the door where she had stood with $11 in her pocket and a question she had not been willing to ask out loud. She drove all the way to the Fire Road turnoff before she changed her mind and turned the truck around. Not because she was ready, because she was tired of not being ready. She parked in front of the shop and went in and set the certified copy on the counter and did not say anything for a moment. Orin looked at the paper and then at her and waited. "You pay me $11 a stone," she said. "The reference guide at the library says Almandine gem grade runs $30 to $80 wholesale. I am not asking why you pay less. I am asking why you never told me the difference." Orin did not flinch. He did not look away. He reached under the counter and brought out a ledger of his own. Older than hers, thicker. The binding held together with tape at the spine. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it so she could read the columns. 30 years of buying and selling. Almandine rough, uncut at Butte from unverified sources. Purchase price $8 to $15, depending on size and clarity. Sale price, after cutting and polishing to jewelers in Missoula and Helena, $40 to $90. Cost of cutting, time, risk of breakage, approximately 50% loss rate on rough stone. Wheel wear, grit compound, the overhead of keeping a shop open on a side street in a town where the mines were closing and the money was leaving. I pay you market price for rough stone at Butte, he said, not more and not less. I am not a charity and you are not a victim. She looked at the numbers. She did the arithmetic in her head, the way she had learned to do arithmetic that fall, fast and twice, and with no room for the answer she wanted to crowd out the answer that was true. $11 for a rough stone, $60 or $70 for the same stone cut and polished. The difference was not theft, it was skill. It was the 30 years Orin had spent learning where to put the wheel and how hard to press and when to stop, and it was the cost of the grit compound and the wheel wear and the 50% of stones that cracked during cutting and became worthless. And it was the fact that she did not know any of those things yet. The book in the library had given her a number. Orin's ledger gave her a context for the number, and the context changed everything. He closed the ledger and set it back under the counter. Then he looked at her and his voice changed. Not softer exactly, but different. The voice of a man who is about to offer something he has thought about for a long time and is not sure will be accepted. But if you want to learn to cut, he said, I will teach you, no charge. Because your uncle should have learned 30 years ago, and he did not, and that was his loss, and the mountain's loss. And there is no sense in it being yours too. She did not answer right away. She stood in his shop with the certified copy on the counter, and the coffee can under her arm and the weight of everything that had happened to him since October sitting on her shoulders. And she thought about what it meant to trust a man who had kept a secret for 28 years and was now offering to undo it one lesson at a time. She said yes. She found him at the property line on Wednesday the way she knew she would. Standing near the same fence post, hands in his jacket, same as before. She did not park the truck or cut the engine. She got out and walked over and handed him the certified copy and the original both, side by side, so he could see they matched each other and matched what she was telling him. He read them slow, lips moving a little, sounding out the words under his breath because the reading mattered. He got to the bottom, to the name and the stamp, and he went quiet in a different way from before. Not calculating, just settling. He never told my grandfather he had gotten around to filing it, Colton said, mostly to himself. Does not look like he told anybody much of anything, Lenore said. Colton folded the papers along their old creases and handed them back. Careful. The way a man handles something he has just learned belongs to someone else. Then he looked at her and said the thing she was not expecting. It was Pemberton. He is the one who told me about the stones. She did not move, did not blink, stood there on the frost-hard ground with the papers in her hand and waited for the rest of it. He came to the bank in September, Colton said, before you even got up here. Said there was a mining claim above Ruby Creek that was about to go for back taxes and that it had more than silver on it. Said, if I pressed the mineral rights through my grandfather's records, he could buy the surface at auction when you could not pay to fight it. We would split the surface, and whatever was on that heap and whatever was under it. He said it flat, looking at the ground. The way a man says a thing he is ashamed of, but has decided to say anyway, because the shame of keeping it is worse than the shame of telling it. Lenore stood there a long moment. September. Before she had even arrived, Pemberton had been planning this since before she put the bolt cutters on that padlock, before she found the first stone, before she walked into Orin's shop or paid the first dollar of the tax bill. He had been sitting in his glass-walled office looking at a tax roll and a claim number and seeing opportunity in a girl who had not yet set foot on her own ground. I did not know about the filing until today, Colton said. If his claim was recorded proper, mine was never going to hold. Birch knew that. He took my money anyway. She stood there a long moment, thinking about Pemberton sitting in his glass-walled office, with his vest and his polished handles, and his $500 offer that was never really an offer at all. It was the first move in a sequence he had already planned. Send Colton up the mountain with a pencil note and a lawyer. Let the legal costs drain what little money she had. Let the taxes stack up again when she could not cut stones because of an injunction that would never survive a courtroom but did not need to survive a courtroom. It only needed to survive long enough for her to drown in it. Then buy the land at auction for nothing and own the Garnet and the surface and the claim and the cabin and the heap. And nobody would ever have to know how he got it, because that is how things work in a county, where the banker has patience and a 19-year-old girl has nothing but a chisel and a composition notebook and a handful of red stones in a coffee can by the stove. Good luck with it, Colton said. He meant it. She could hear it in his voice, the difference between a man saying words and a man meaning them. He had been used, and he knew it, and knowing it had cost him something he would carry for a while. He turned and walked back down toward the fire road where his truck sat, boots crunching frost that had not burned off yet. She watched him go and did not call after him and did not feel the satisfaction she had expected to feel. She felt tired and clear and angry in a way that did not need to shout because it knew exactly where it was going. She drove to Deer Lodge the next morning, parked on Main Street in front of the Powell County Savings and Trust. The brass handles caught the December light and threw it back at her, and she pushed through them without stopping to check her reflection, because she already knew what she looked like. A 19-year-old girl in a canvas coat with rock dust on the cuffs and chisel calluses on both hands, and an expression that had nothing to do with friendliness and everything to do with clarity. She walked past the teller and past the chairs by the window where she had sat the first time, when she had not asked for Pemberton and had been given him anyway, and into his glass-walled office without waiting for an invitation. The teller said something behind her that she did not hear and did not need to. He was at his desk. The same vest, the same tie with the engineered knot, the same hands folded over his stomach. A cup of coffee sat untouched on a coaster to his right, still steaming, which meant he had just poured it, which meant he had not been expecting company. He looked up when she came in and his face did not change. Not surprise. Not alarm. The controlled blankness of a man who has spent decades in a profession where the first person to show an emotion is the first person to lose leverage. She set the certified copy on his desk. She set the original beside it. She did not sit down. I know you sent Colton Ferris up my mountain, she said. I know you told him about the stones. I know you were planning to buy the surface at auction when I could not afford to fight his claim. I know Birch filed a motion with a procedural defect on a retained interest that was never recorded. And I know Colton told me everything yesterday afternoon because he looked at this paper and understood that you used him the way you use a chisel, to open something up so you could take what was inside. Pemberton did not move, did not unfold his hands, did not look at the papers on his desk. He looked at her. That is a lot of knowing for a 19-year-old girl with a cabin and a pile of rocks, he said. The knowing part is free, Mr. Pemberton, she said. It is what I do with it that costs money, and right now I do not need much of yours. My taxes are current, my claim is recorded. Your motion has a defect, and the man you sent up the mountain just walked away from the whole thing. She stood up, picked up the original, left the certified copy on his desk because it was a copy, and copies are cheap, and because she wanted him to have something to look at after she left. Something with a county seal on it that said surface and mineral in type that did not fade. He did not call after her. She did not expect him to. Men like Pemberton do not chase, they wait. But this time there was nothing left to wait for. The claim was clean. The paper was real. The pencil note was exactly what Marin Jessup had said it was. Not a recorded instrument, not a signature, not anything a court would weigh against a stamp. She walked out through the brass-handled doors and into the cold December air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at Main Street. The courthouse was 3 blocks down, the recorder's office where Marin Jessup kept the books that said what was true and what was not. the hardware store where she bought nails, the library where she had sat with a reference book and learned the distance between 11 and 30. This town had been the landscape of her survival for 3 months, and she knew it now the way. She knew the heap and the cabin and the fire road by the things it could give her and the things it could take away. She got into her truck and drove north toward the mountains with the window cracked because the cab smelled like kerosene and old paper, and she wanted to breathe something clean. The teaching began the second Saturday of December. She drove to Orin's shop in the afternoon, and he led her through the back room where the cutting equipment sat on a bench he had built himself from railroad ties and planks. A lap wheel the size of a dinner plate. Grit compounds in jars labeled in a hand she now recognized as his father's. A set of dops and faceting guides hanging on the wall like surgical instruments. He did not start with the good stones. He started with the shards, the broken halves she had ruined in October by swinging too hard at the heap, worth nothing as gems, worth everything as practice. He showed her how to set a stone in the dop with wax, how to read the crystal structure to find the plane where the facets wanted to go, how to brinks the stone to the wheel at an angle that took material off in thousandths of an inch instead of hundredths. Too fast, he said. Too hard. This stone is telling you what it wants to become. You have to let it. It was the same principle the heap had taught her in October. Listen before you pry. Wait for the sound to change. Let the thing you are working on tell you where the seam is, instead of deciding for yourself where it ought to be. The same lesson in a different room, spoken by Kid a different voice, applied to the same red stone. Her first cut was not good. The facets were uneven, one side ground too flat, and the other not enough. And when she held it up to the lamp, it caught light on only half its face, the other half sitting dark and dull where the angles were wrong. She set it on the bench and looked at it, seeing both what it was and what it was supposed to be. Orin picked it up and held it to the lamp himself for a long time. Then he set it down and said a number, $35. And that is not charity. She stared at him. $11 for the rough stone. $35 for the same stone with her first clumsy facets cut into it. The difference was not magic. It was the difference between handing someone a raw thing and handing them a thing that someone had cared enough to shape. 3 times the value for the same piece of mountain, multiplied not by volume or by luck, but by the willingness to learn a skill that took patience and steady hands, and the kind of attention that does not look away when the wheel is spinning. The winter came in hard after that. Snow sitting on the ridge above the cabin by mid-December, the creek frozen solid by Christmas, the truck not starting most mornings until she poured hot water from the stove kettle over the battery terminals and waited. She cut stones in the cabin on the nights when the wind was too strong to sleep through, working by lantern light at a makeshift bench she built from the same stump her great-uncle had bolted his grinder to. The lap wheel Orin lent her was small enough to run by hand crank, and the sound it made in the quiet cabin was a high, thin singing that she came to associate with the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, when the cold was worst and the work was steadiest. She brought the cut stones to Orin on Saturdays. He graded them under his lamp and named prices that climbed as her technique improved. 35 became 40 by the end of December. Then in January, the wheel seized. A bearing froze in the cold, and the lap plate locked, and she forced it, and the plate cracked. A sound like a pistol shot in the cabin at 2 in the morning, and the stone she had been working on for 3 hours flew off the dop and hit the far wall and shattered. She sat in the dark after the lantern blew out from the force of her own cursing and did not move for a long time. She told Orin about it the following Saturday. He listened and then went to the back room and came out with a second lap plate, older than the first, the steel worn, thin at the edges from decades of his own hands pressing stones to it. He set it on the counter without ceremony. That one belonged to my father, he said. It has cut more stone than anything in this shop. Treat it accordingly. She carried it up the mountain in the truck with both hands on it at every bump, because the plate was irreplaceable, and the road was not kind, and the distance between the two was measured in trust, and Orin had just given her more of it than he had given anyone. Since his father died, 40 became 45. By February, she was cutting stones that Orin held up to the light and turned slowly without comment, which she had learned was his highest form of praise, the absence of correction. In late February, a letter arrived from the district court. The motion Birch had filed had been reviewed and returned with a note from the clerk. Procedural defect. The retained interest cited in the motion had never been recorded as an instrument in the Powell County books, and the court could not grant a preliminary injunction based on an unrecorded claim. The motion was dismissed without prejudice, which meant Birch could file again. But Lenore understood what Marin Jessup had told her months ago. What was in the book was what counted, and what was in the book was her name. She kept the green notebook current through all of it. The columns tighter now, the numbers more confident. Revenue from rough sales. Revenue from cut sales. The difference between the two growing wider each week, as her hands learned what Orin's hands had spent 30 years learning. She did not stop selling rough stones entirely. Some weeks the heap gave her more than she could cut, and the $11 was still $11. Still the foundation everything else was built on. But the balance shifted. By spring, she was earning more from 3 cut stones than she had earned from 10 rough ones the previous fall. And somewhere in that winter, though she could not have pointed to the exact day it happened, the arithmetic in the green notebook stopped being about survival and started being about something else. Not wealth. Nothing close to wealth, but sufficiency. The feeling of having exactly enough and knowing where the next enough was coming from. A feeling she had never had before in her life, not once, not even when her grandmother was alive and the house smelled like oatmeal in the morning and the bills were someone else's problem. The snow melted in March. The creek ran loud and brown with it, and the fire road turned to mud for 3 weeks. And she did not drive to town at all during that stretch. Just worked the heap and cut stones and let the mountain do what the mountain does in spring, which is everything all at once. Orin's eyes started going in April. He did not tell her about it. She noticed because the loop stayed screwed into his eye socket longer than it used to, and because he started holding stones at arm's length before bringing them to the lamp, and because one Saturday he set a stone down and looked at it for a long time and then looked away and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, pressing hard suckmet, the gesture of a man trying to push something back into place that will not stay. He had been behind that counter for 38 years. His father before him for 20. The lamp and the loop and the bench and the stones had been the vocabulary of his entire adult life, and the vocabulary was going dark one word at a time. She did not know what that felt like. She only knew what it looked like from the other side of the counter. And what it looked like was a man standing very still in the center of a room that was getting smaller. Then, one Saturday in May, he set a stone down and looked at it, and then looked at her, and said something he had never said before in all the months she had been coming to his shop. "What do you think?" he said. Not what he thought, what she thought. And she understood that something had shifted between them that had nothing to do with eyes and everything to do with the moment when a teacher realizes the student does not need the teaching anymore. Only the permission to trust what they have learned. She told him what she thought. She said the stone was good. Deep color, even saturation, clean on 5 of 6 facets, the 6th needing another pass at finer grit. She said it would bring $50 from the jeweler in Helena if the setting was right. He nodded, took the loop out of his eye, set it on the counter beside the stone. And then he did not pick either of them up again. That spring she began going to Orin's shop not as a student, and not as a seller, but as something in between. He showed her the inventory system, the supplier contacts in Missoula and Helena and Bozeman, the wholesale accounts he had built over 30 years, the customers who came in looking for Montana gems and walked out with Almandine garnets from a mountain they would never see, cut by hands they would never know. By June, he had given her a key to the back room. By August, he had stopped coming in on Saturdays. By the following October, a full year after she'd first walked through his door with 3 rough stones in a shop rag, he told her he was done. Not retiring. Done. His eyes would not let him cut anymore, and a man who cannot cut has no business standing behind a counter telling other people what their stones are worth. He did not sell her the shop. He gave her the counter space. She paid rent on the building to the landlord in Butte and kept the Gaskell and Sons sign in the window because taking it down felt like pulling a nail that was still holding something together. It is 5 years on now. She is writing this from a cabin with a roof that does not leak, which still feels like a small miracle every time it rains hard in October, and she lies there hearing nothing but the sound itself. No drip finding the coffee can she used to keep by the stove for exactly that purpose. The cedar shakes have gone silver gray the way cedar does, weathered down to match the rock around it. And if you did not know better, you would think the roof had always looked like that. Like it came with the mountain, instead of costing her $11 a stone, 2 and 3 sales a week, all the way from October of 1987 to a Tuesday morning last spring, when she paid the last of what she owed and had a little left over. Besides, taxes are current every year since. She keeps the receipts in the same Hills Brothers coffee can, which seemed right. The can that held the proof of what was hers now holds the proof she has kept it. The last time she saw Orin was a Thursday in September. He drove up the fire road in his old truck, moving slow the way he moved now. And she met him at the porch with coffee she had made on the same riverside stove that had come with the cabin 5 years before. He sat in the chair she had built from leftover lumber and looked out at the slag heap and the ridge above it and the sky doing what the sky does in September in Montana, which is everything it knows how to do at once. He had brought something with him, a box made of cherry wood small enough to hold in 2 hands, with brass hinges and a clasp that opened without a sound. The wood had been sanded smooth and finished with something that brought out the grain, and the corners were joined with dovetails so precise they looked like they had grown together instead of being cut. It was the kind of box a man makes when he has something worth keeping and wants the keeping to be worthy of the thing. Inside, set into individual pockets of blelt, arranged in rows, were 52 garnets, cut and polished, each one catching the afternoon light from a different angle, each one holding a slightly different shade of red, from the near black of deep winter stones to the bright arterial red of ones pulled from the heap in July, when the sun was high enough to heat the rock, and the crystals came out warm in her hands. She looked at them and did not understand at first. Then she counted the pockets and the understanding came. 52, 1 for every week of her first year. He had kept 1 stone from every batch she brought in. Every Tuesday or Saturday she had set her shop rag on his counter and unfolded it. He had palmed 1 stone and put it aside. Cut them at night after the shop was closed, when his eyes were still good enough for the wheel, and his hands still steady enough for the dop. 1 a week for a year. 52 stones from her mountain, shaped by his hands arranged in the order she had brought them. The first one was small, dark, cut a little rough, the facets not quite symmetrical, the polish uneven in the way that polish gets when a man is working on something he cares about more than he cares about getting it perfect. It was the first stone she had ever sold him. The walnut-sized one from the day she walked in with a shop rag and no idea what Almandine meant. The last one was flawless. A deep wine red that held light the way a held breath holds silence. Every facet precise, every angle calculated, every surface polished to a clarity that made the stone look like it was lit from inside. It was the last stone he cut before his eyes went. The best work of his life, done in the quiet of a closed shop on a Tuesday night in September a year ago, and she had not known about it until this moment. He did not explain. He did not say what they meant or why he had done it, or what she was supposed to do with 52 garnets in a cherrywood box that was worth more as a record of patience and attention than anything the stones themselves would bring on a jeweler's bench. He drank his coffee. He looked at the heap. He said the light was good today, which was the closest Orin Gaskell ever came to saying something was beautiful. Then he drove back down the fire road, and she stood on the porch holding the box with both hands and watching. The dust settled behind him the way she had watched Colton's dust settle a year ago, except this settling felt like an ending that was also a beginning. The way the last page of a book is also the first page of whatever the reader does next. She still takes stones to the shop, not Orin's shop anymore, and not hers exactly, but something in between, something that carries the name of a man's father on a sign she will never take down. She grades them herself now under the bench lamp, turning them the way Orin taught her, looking for color and clarity, and the particular quality that makes one stone worth cutting and another worth setting aside for a day, when her hands are steadier, or her eyes are sharper, or the light is better. She still drives home with just enough, and not a dollar more, because that is the pace the mountains set, and she never found a reason to argue with it. Her great-uncle threw away for 35 years what turned out to be the only thing on this claim worth keeping. He worked a vein of silver that gave out and cursed at rock that would have bought him a decade of good winters if he had looked at it twice. He was not foolish. He was looking kind of worth and missed another, sitting right there in his own tailings pile, waiting on somebody patient enough to ask a different question of it. That is the whole lesson, if there is one. Worth is not always where you were told to look for it. Sometimes it is in what the last man threw over the edge, because he did not have the eyes for it yet, or the need, or the years left to wonder. She had the need, she had the years, that turned out to be enough. She is still here, still splitting her own wood, still walking that slag heap most mornings out of habit more than necessity now, picking through what is left, with the same slow attention her great-uncle spent on silver he never found. The mountain does not lie. It just waits for you to ask the right question. And if you have got a place like this, something left to you, something you found behind a wall or under a pile nobody else wanted, tell us about it below. And if you want more of these, stay a while. There is always another story waiting in the ground.